Hi, I'm going to give an introduction to boundary objects. I'm going to start by talking about what other people have said about boundary objects and some definitions, but more importantly for our purposes, I'm going to tell you how I think about boundary objects and how I use that term in our project. So boundary objects were first introduced in this paper in 1989 by Starr and Griesemer. And this is the one that you'll see a lot of people cite when they talk about boundary objects. They introduced it to talk about how scientists and what they call amateurs interacted in a museum. And so they pointed out that there's a tension in science between different viewpoints and heterogeneity in those viewpoints. But they also pointed out that science requires cooperation to create common understanding. They further observed that consensus is not necessary for cooperation or for the successful conduct of work. So a lot of times people work together and they don't actually agree on what they're working on. They defined a boundary object as something that lies at, guess what, a boundary. And that boundary could be between practitioners and scientists. It could be between two different disciplines. Anytime there are two communities or more communities that see things in different ways and use things in different ways, but are using essentially the same thing. Another definition of a boundary object is a term that facilitates communication across disciplinary borders by creating shared vocabulary. And it doesn't require that you're able to define the term precisely. It just means that you're able to share the definition. So here's an example, and this is the paper that just gave the last definition. These two people proposed resilience as a boundary object. And resilience is a concept that is used throughout ecology and throughout sustainability work. And they pointed out that people looked at resilience differently, but they could possibly use it to talk about similar concepts. This is a very different example. This author suggested that boundary objects can be used to communicate about technological devices and how they get adopted. And he suggested that communication could be around some property of the object. So you could try to describe what you thought that object contained, or around performance. And he went on to describe boundary objects and select some from his example that included surgical sterility and different kinds of objects used in the sterile environment. He further pointed out that the boundary object, since it was introduced, has been discussed in fields ranging from educational practice to organization science. And there are just a very wide range of definitions of boundary objects. So if boundary objects could have any definition, what is the use of them? So now I'm going to say, what is my operational definition? It is something that is specific, even if it's poorly defined, it's a specific thing. It is influential in multiple domains. People want to talk about it. People recognize that it has an influence. And this is the most important thing to me, it enables collective sense-making of whatever that object is. So I'm going to give an example. There's a famous poem about blind men and an elephant. And you've probably all heard it, but it depends on which part of the elephant that you're talking about. So a person grabbing the trunk might say it's like a snake. A person grabbing the tail might say it's like a rope. A person hugging the leg might say it's the trunk of a tree. And then somebody's at the tusk saying, no, it's a spear. This illustration is often used to describe how people could be talking about the same thing and using different vocabulary and not understanding each other. But what if all of these people were trying to figure out what the elephant was? So what if the elephant enabled them to try to figure out the shape of an elephant because they all had different experiences? In contrast, what if we did what people often do, get a bunch of different people who are relevant to the same thing and say, put them all in the same room? I've been in several meetings where we're just going to get all the people in the same room. What if they had nothing to talk about? So the elephant is an object that enables the beginning of the conversation. The elephant is the boundary object. So a boundary object is specific, and you might start with, there is something in this room with us. I don't know what it is, but I sense it. A boundary object is influential in multiple domains. So everybody wants to know what they've got a hold of in the case of the elephant. And it enables collective sense making. Let's talk about this elephant, or you may not know it's an elephant. Let's talk about this object. How could it be constructed so that it has all these properties? So in our project, Respect, one of the key boundary objects is well-being. Well-being is something that we can't define, but we all look in the same direction when we're talking about well-being. It is influential in many domains, and it's going to enable a conversation about what is well-being really. Even if we never define it, we will begin to try to make sense out of it by bringing our different perspectives. There are a couple of other boundary objects in Respect. One is heterogeneity. So that is, how do things differ? If we were to chop things up or chop people up into different categories and divide them, what would those categories be? And then there's another one that's called the paradigm of change. We're going to start by exploring that well-being as a boundary object and learn to explore boundary objects together. But these are things that we can coalesce around that may be poorly defined, but that we all recognize as important. And simply having an object to have a conversation about will enable us to move toward definition and functionality.